The fourth industrial revolution that we're currently in, I'm not quite certain whether the future looks like somebody keeping one job forever. What do you think about where South Africa is today and where you think it is supposed to be?
We have become lost in liberation blackmail. And we've been told the story for so long that life is better than it was during Apartheid, that we have failed to appreciate how far ahead we should be at this point. So I think South Africa is very far behind where it should be. And we've actually lost the capacity to even imagine something beyond the status quo. And that's really what worries me, that we think that this is all that there could possibly be. The new MK party, I think we actually have to take them very seriously in this election. If they, tick all the boxes and are able to go on the ballot and they survive their court challenges and internal disputes, I think they're really going to set the cat among the pigeons in this election. And we haven't seen polling data yet because it's all before they came in, but I can already see them maybe shaving off 4% of ANC. There are certain definitions of democracy where you don't have a democracy until you've had a change in government. So we call ourselves a democracy, but we don't actually know whether we're a democracy or not, because you only know that you're in a democracy when government changes.
Welcome to the Fix Africa podcast, where we discuss solutions. Today's guest is a very special guest who wears many hats and is known by many as a public broadcaster, a podcaster, a musician, an author, an intellectual, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation. Let's welcome to the Fix Africa podcast, Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. Welcome, Sizwe. I've been meaning to actually sit down with you for some time now. I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks, Mpho. Really appreciate it.
Let's talk about your surname, Sizwe Welsh Mpofu-Walsh. I know where the Mpofu comes from. Where does the Welsh come from?
That question has plagued me for my entire life. It's my mother's maiden name.
Okay.
So it's basically my mother's surname. But she got married after that, so she has a different surname.
Cool. So you chose to keep both.
Yeah.
And why is that?
I wanted to acknowledge the role that my mother had played in my life, because ultimately she raised me. Most people see me through the prism of my father. But I wanted to acknowledge her role in my life because she was effectively a single mother. I still have a good relationship with my father. I love him very much. He was present in my life, but my mother raised me and I wanted that to be marked in my name.
It's quite interesting. I mean, you wear many hats. You're a broadcaster, you're a musician, which I thought was quite interesting as well. You're an author, you're an activist. What is the role that you're currently now focusing on in your career?
Well, I've always done many things, and I think I'm still trying to balance those many different things. I think one of the beauties of life in South Africa right now, especially for Black South Africans, is that we no longer have to fit in with the traditional boundaries of just doing one thing. And for the first time, probably the first generation, we are able to break molds and do multiple different things that people didn't think were possible before. And so, yes, you can be a rap musician one day and then an Oxford scholar the next, and people are not used to that, but I think we're at the time now where we can break those molds, and that's what I'm excited about doing. I get excited when I wake up in the morning by trying to do different things that haven't been done, and I hope that my life will be a combination of things that are very unexpected and unlikely, but that are all done well, and that's what I aspire to.
I love that. I mean, our parents sort of grew up in a day and age where, they had to do the same career forever. And we're seeing a new generation of people that are saying, look, I want to change careers. I want to try different things. I think that's quite important. I mean, in the fourth industrial revolution that we're currently in, I'm not quite certain whether the future looks like somebody keeping one job forever. What do you think about where South Africa is today and where you think it is supposed to be?
I think we have become lost in liberation blackmail. And we've been told the story for so long that life is better than it was during Apartheid, that we have failed to appreciate how far ahead we should be at this point. So I think South Africa is very far behind where it should be. And we've actually lost the capacity to even imagine something beyond the status quo. And that's really what worries me, that we think that this is all that there could possibly be, when there are societies who after 30 years have gone through dramatic transformations economically, socially, even politically, and we feel stuck. It feels like we're spinning our wheels. It feels like there's nothing new and nothing fresh happening in our economy and in our society. And, you know, with the digital transformations that are upon us, I think this is a tremendous moment for South Africa, you know, to take advantage of those opportunities. But it feels like the politics is getting in the way of unlocking the dynamism that's so apparent in our country.
I mean, let's talk about that. I mean, you wrote a book about politics delusion, and I mean, you studied at Oxford University, and it was international relations, I believe. And congratulations,
Thank you.
Dr. Mpofu-Walsh. But I want to talk about that to say that many people are not aware of democracy or how other governments function outside of what they've seen in South Africa. And I think majority of the voting base have only known apartheid and the government after apartheid. They've never known a government that is effective and efficient and is able to do things in the right way.
Sure.
And having studied international relations, can you shed more light as to what other governments have been able to do in 30 years or even longer periods for the viewer out there who's saying, but from what I see, the 350 grant I'm getting is amazing. You know, I was able to study at an FET college. I might not have a job. And that person believes that that's it. That's all a government is supposed to do. What can you say about that?
I mean, when you look at, and I looked at this in my first book, one of the best measures for the extent to which people in a society are flourishing, or at least the easiest measure, is GDP per capita, i.e., the amount of GDP divided by the population, how much money each person has, right? And when you look at South Africa, and I looked at it by that point over 20 years, it had remained roughly stagnant since the end of apartheid, which is shocking when you really think about it. I mean, apartheid was literally designed to subjugate most of the economy, or at least most of the people in the economy. When you look at even countries like Botswana, just our domestic neighbor, they'd grown much more than we had. And then you get to transformational states like South Korea or Vietnam, particularly in Asia, where, I mean, the growth rates dwarf ours, and you know, sometimes they can be 10 times South Africa's. So what is beautiful about looking at other parts of the world is that you can see that, yes, there are places where things have gone worse than South Africa, and sometimes we over-dramatize how bad things are in South Africa. And yes, there is a worse scenario, but there are many better scenarios. For me, what's interesting and what I think we need to aspire to is I think there are societies in the world that have grown their economies dramatically, but have avoided the democratic path. So there are people who have prosperity, but they don't necessarily have freedom. And then there are societies that have pursued the democratic path, but have failed to produce prosperity. And so they have freedom, but they don't have wealth. Then there are those few societies that are both democratic and rich. A society like Japan, for example. And I think that's the golden highway that we want to go down as South Africa. I don't think we need to sacrifice our democratic freedoms, but we want that and we want wealth. And if we can achieve that, we can truly be one of the most vibrant countries in the world.
I like that. I mean, your dad was the chairperson of the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF, Mr. Mpofu. And I've always wondered to say, how has that affected your political outlook? Are you a socialist? Are you a communist? Are you capitalist? What have you taken from that? And do you differ with your dad's perspective on political matters?
Yeah, well, welcome to my life, because it's shaped my life dramatically for good and for ill. There are people who are prepared to listen to me because of who my father is and give me the time of day and assume that I'm, you know, superior because of, you know, my relationship to him, and quite the opposite. There are people who turn off before they even start to listen to what I'm saying. I think one place, because I now work in the media, that I've felt that is that people often assume that my platforms or my shows are following some kind of EFF agenda because I happen to be related to someone who's in the EFF. And I always chuckle, because if you actually knew my family history, you'd see I'm far more integrated into the ANC than I actually am into the EFF. But because people only know the surface, they jump to these conclusions. And good luck with this podcast, because people are going to jump to all kinds of conclusions. So that gets a bit tiresome at points, because you get tired of being prejudged for good or for bad. And one of the things that was so liberating about going to Oxford was that, and I also need to clarify this, my father did not pay for my Oxford study. People always come to me on Twitter and they're like, yeah, your father was part of the EFF, but he paid for you to go to Oxford. And I'm like, he didn't pay for me to go to Oxford. I got a scholarship to go to Oxford. But what was so liberating about being there was that nobody knew who my father was. And for the first time, I could see whether I could just be judged based on my abilities and my capacities. And I thrived and I succeeded. And I was like, okay, I certainly get some advantages and some disadvantages in South Africa, but there is something there, and that was important for me to appreciate and to understand. So yeah, that's what I would say about his impact and his public role in influencing my life. We laugh about it and we talk about it, and we always have this joke, you know, what are we going to do in the conspiratorial meeting today? What are we going to put on the airwaves? But he has no role in any of my shows. I'm quite tired of the labels of capitalism and communism and socialism. I have looked at them and I have studied them and thought about them in quite a lot of depth, but my general viewpoint is that I think that they are currently concealing more than they reveal in the South African. Yes, and I think what we're missing in South Africa is, before we put ourselves into different camps, it's also a question of timing, because there are certain states that have had an emphasis on state ownership and more centralized control at certain points in their economic history, and then they liberalize that, free that up at other points, and vice versa. And I think the question now for South Africa is, what's the right combination? What's the right combination of state ownership, and when, and for how long? And that's the question I think we need to be having, rather than should everything be owned by the state or should everything be subject to the free market. And I think there are interesting places where the state can intervene where it isn't intervening. And I think there are interesting places where the state currently intervenes where it shouldn't be intervening anymore. And that's the conversation that I care about. But the socialism, capitalism thing, I really think, I appreciate it, and it's an important philosophical conversation. But as far as policy is concerned, I think it's really locking us into old-fashioned ways of thinking, and we need to break out of those.
That's true. I mean, with my experience with the Rise of Africa and reaching out to young people and telling them to vote, the moment you talk about this, they switch off. They're like, what are you saying? I didn't sign up for this. To them, it's what is the practical idea, and use your words, you know?
Sure.
I had a young person say to me the other day when I was explaining to them how capitalism works, and they were like, no, just use your words. Is this person starting a business? Are they employing people? And I thought, this is an interesting perspective. Yeah. But I want us to look at your role in the SABC. I mean, so you've got your own podcast, of course, and you've done so many different amazing things. But you then went to the SABC. Why did you go to the SABC?
Well, the SABC came to me, actually.
Okay.
And, they said, we'd like you to come on, and, there's a show that we want to do. It's a primetime show. It's at 8 to 9, and it's twice a week. And initially, I said, I don't think this is going to be possible because I've got a job at Wits and I have my own podcast. And they made an offer, which was appealing. But also, the sheer reach of the SABC is something that you can't underestimate. As we produce these streams of content on digital media, things are growing, and they're growing very exponentially and impressively. But my show goes on SABC3, and that's just like, everywhere. And it reaches corners that the digital audience can't reach.
That's true. Yeah.
So that was why I ultimately decided that it would be important to go on the public broadcaster. There were those who were like, oh, you're selling out the digital media and the independence. And I understood that, but I couldn't justify not being able to occupy that platform and try to, direct it in new and fresh ways that I thought were necessary. Whether that's been possible or not it's always a balance, because the SABC is, it's state-owned, and in some ways that helps with its public mandate, but that also means that the state, and particularly the governing party, I think, feels as though sometimes they have they have an influence over it.
Yeah, and that's what I want to ask you to say. the SABC should be independent in terms of the state should not influence it. It should have a governing system of its own that influences it. Is that what you found?
Look, what I will say is you feel a lot of pressures at the SABC. The one liberating thing about the podcast is nobody calls you afterwards to say, like, why did you do this? Or you shouldn't say that. Nobody calls to complain. Whereas at the SABC, the terrain is so old and traditional that the minute you go one way, you get calls. My show has got calls to be like, why did you say that? That was wrong.
But are these calls from SABC staff, politicians, or are they a staff member acting on a politician saying, call him and shout at him?
No, not call him and shout at him, but there were instances where we did shows and people felt that they didn't get a chance to reply. And they were like, why did you give this person a platform without bringing us on? And then we had to apologize, in the next show. So you do kind of, you often don't get like an explicit, hey, don't do this because such and such person called me. But you always have to be mindful of the size of the platform and the fact that if you do one thing, you've got to make sure that you balance it out with another.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And if I mean, you've been at the SABC. If you were the CEO of the SABC, what would be the things that you would change about it?
Oh, my goodness. I mean, that's a great question. And you know what I have found? We talk a lot about corruption being the problem in South Africa. And for sure, let's not get it twisted. Corruption is a huge problem. But I think there's an attendant problem of complacency and of a lack of innovation and a lack of energy and a lack of pushing things in new directions. And so I think that state-owned enterprises could be dynamic, but there's just this culture that has set in which it's very hard to adapt and innovate, right? So I would really try to lead the SABC down a whole digital revolution and transformation, and I don't think in many ways even the SABC appreciates how much gold it has in its hands, and we're about to embark on this new digital moment in South African life where digital media is going to become the center and it's going to displace traditional media. But the SABC can be at the forefront of that, and I would shift the SABC in that direction, and I would use its massive platforms to almost overtake and override digital media and become the place where people are experiencing the SABC outside of traditional platforms.
I definitely agree with you, and I was saying to somebody that I think the SABC's next biggest move is to zero rate all their content. If the SABC could create platforms, applications where people can watch for like free data and they put the adverts and whatever the case is, the growth would be exponential. Yeah. Let's talk about your book.
Now that you've got me fired, yeah.
Hopefully they do not do that. So I mean, your new book, the topic for me was very fascinating. The new apartheid. I thought this is aggressive, Yeah. Let's talk a bit about that. Why that aggressive title? Firstly.
Well, it sold a lot of books. Firstly.
Yes. Yeah. Clearly, and also let's also look at how do we fix this new apartheid. But firstly, let's explain the problem. What is the new apartheid?
No, for sure. I mean, look, the title was naughty. It was out there. And I do a lot in the book to explain what the title means. So a lot of people look at the book and they're like, oh, the new apartheid. Oh, you're just blaming apartheid for everything again. And that's not at all what the book is about. The new apartheid is an attempt to express that even though we have made many gains in democratic South Africa since 1994, there are still aspects of our society that mirror the kind of patterns of apartheid that were more obvious and more state-backed in the previous era. So the key thesis of the book is that apartheid did not die, it was privatized. And so apartheid has moved and shifted into the private sphere. Now, along with that is not an attempt to shift focus from the ANC government and its dramatic failures. That is a second problem. So we live in this current moment where we haven't uprooted apartheid fully, especially within the private realm of South African life. And on the other hand, we have a state that is both incapable and incompetent to drive forward the developmental goals that would also uproot apartheid. So we sit in the situation where we haven't uprooted the old apartheid, and that has metastasized and evolved into a new form of apartheid, in which, in fact, the ANC government has become not only an innocent bystander, but complicit in reinforcing this new form of apartheid. One easy way of thinking about it, and I look at it in many spheres of South African life, is how we live residentially. Not only just the major apartheid patterns of life, where townships have now developed their own townships, rather than us rethinking spatial life in South Africa, but even if you go into gated communities, the only way to really live a secure life in South Africa now is to enclose yourself. And there's no way to get out of that. I'm not saying I don't live in an enclosed space or work in enclosed spaces. What I'm saying is that it's impossible to live and work productively in South Africa unless you're enclosed. And that enclosure has always been a key signature of apartheid. The signage of apartheid, the fact that it's state-backed, is gone. And there is no single authority now driving apartheid like there was with the National Party. But it developed a momentum of its own that is still with us in society, and we have been incapable of reversing that momentum. So I think one of our key tasks as our generation is to uproot the momentum of apartheid, even though no one is consciously driving it.
I think for me, the title is very clear as to what's actually going on, to say it is apartheid. And I think the danger of it, and I've always wanted to ask this, is to say a lot of people have always said that it's called white monopoly capital. And a lot of people came back and they said, but that's not what, you can't call it that. Why are you putting the white there? There's some black folks that are also part of it, that have benefited through BEE deals, etc.
Sure.
And for me, my question has always been to say, if we are to deal with this new apartheid of the private sector owning everything, surely our first standpoint should be the banks. To say the Reserve Bank and the banks that we've got, how do we ensure that we uproot that? In your thoughts, I mean, what do you think should be the first point of attack when we're dealing with this new apartheid in our generation?
Well, if apartheid has become privatized and decentralized, and it's not really pushed by one central consciousness or authority, then for me it follows that there should be a struggle within the private sphere of South African life, in addition to a struggle to reform the state. We have to appreciate that the state and the government, even though it's not doing what it should do, I think is incapable on its own of completely reversing the new apartheid. So I think we need to look at all the private spheres of South African life, whether that's institutions and corporations, like you say, whether that's private residence associations, whether that is schools, whether that is, privatized hospital systems. All of those decentralized private networks of power are the terrain of creating a new just society. And so that's where I think the attention also needs to turn, because like we were talking about with socialism and capitalism earlier, there's this mistaken view that if you can control the state, then you can control the society. But the society has become so privatized and so delinked in many ways from the state that even if you do control the state, you may not be able to control society.
That's profound. And do you think that, how do we relink the private sector? Because, I mean, what you're saying is so true, to say you find that politicians go out there and they don't have any sense of urgency when it comes to fixing certain things, because one, their child goes to a private school. Their child only plays with all other children that go to a private school. Their child gets a driver that drives them to school and drives them back home. Their child never has to catch a taxi. Whenever their child is sick, they go to a Mediclinic and they're seen by a private doctor. They only wait in line they literally have an appointment. 3 o'clock's the appointment, come in, they leave. Their child goes to a dentist appointment. Their child grows up thinking that this other world does not exist.
Yeah.
So I think what you're saying is so profound, to say that this new apartheid that is being created by the government, and I mean, myself as somebody who's looked into politics, I'm very aggressive about it, to say it was created, is creating a group of people that don't understand this. And when you say to them that, look, Alexandra must be changed, they're like, oh, but why? Because I'm in Sandton and everything is perfect. Why are you creating a ruckus out of this? Absolutely. How do we ensure that we go back to those people? Because the one thing that I said, and I think this was something that I was having a conversation with somebody, is to say that our public officials must feel the brunt of being public officials. And what that means is that if you're representing Alexandra and you're the councillor for Alexandra, you should not be living in Sandton. You should live in Alexandra. So that when there are issues in Alexandra, you're not getting a phone call to say, oh, people in Alex are saying you're actually there. And they're holding each other accountable. And when I said that, somebody said, but you can't dictate where people live. And I thought, okay, that's an interesting curveball there. But how do we ensure that we get our public officials? Because many of them are not aware of the reality on the ground. So how do we ensure that they are aware of it, and not only aware of it, but they actually experience it to the point where they do want to change it?
It's a tough one, because what I'm trying to say in the book as well, just to touch on your analogy of people living in all these different private spheres, schools and clinics, is not just that it's bad that the state hasn't created alternatives, but that it's inescapable. So you either die or you join the private sector, right? It's that simple. Like, we can say we want our politicians to go to public hospitals, but in truth, what we're saying then is that they should die, because that's how bad the system is, right? We can say we want them to send their children to public schools, but their children are going to be dramatically far back in their educational, and nobody wants that, right? So we've created a system where it is inescapable that you have to join the private sphere if you want to survive, right? And that is the problem. So, of course, the dramatic failure of the ANC has been to fail to build a public service, public sector that is, let's not even call it a rival for the private sector yet. Let's just call it an appropriate place to exist as a human being, right? And so because it's inescapable, we're all complicit, right, in it. So I'm not saying that, oh, there's this evil new apartheid out there and I'm sitting here. Like, in order to survive, if I want to survive, I have to participate in the new apartheid. I have to buy something in a privatized, enclosed mall.
Have a solar system. Have backup power.
Otherwise, I die. It's really that simple.
And your business dies, because how do you function with load shedding stage 6?
Yeah. And so that's the power of the new apartheid, and that's the argument that I try to draw. And I think some people have maybe misinterpreted to say that I'm criticizing others and not appreciating my own complicity in the system. In fact, the argument I make is not only that I'm complicit, it's that it's impossible not to be complicit. In terms of your question about democratic representation, sure, it's a real tough one, and I'm afraid I don't have a ready-made answer for that, except to agree with you that there should be a closer relationship between constituencies and people and their representatives. But what I do think we need to do is fundamentally rethink everything. That's the call I'm making in this book. Is it's so funny how we have these massive crises, and the only thing we can think to do is like shift policy 1 degree to the left or 1 degree to the right and assume that it's going to fix it. Like, we have massive structural problems, and I think our generation should be at the forefront of rethinking the entire way in which we constitute our democracy and our society. So is it a new electoral system? Maybe. Let's see. I think there are problems with constituency systems, proportional representation, but does that mean that we should just keep this system? Probably not. What I do think is the best short-term thing. There are certain definitions of democracy where you don't have a democracy until you've had a change in government. So we call ourselves a democracy, but we don't actually know whether we're a democracy or not, because you only know that you're in a democracy when government changes, and we've never had a national change of government. So we think we're a democracy, but we'll see. We'll see, right? And
that's so profound.
Yeah, and I think we need to change government to create that feeling of accountability, not because I'm anti-ANC or pro-ANC, but because incumbency has its own sense of lethargy. And I think part of the problems that we're experiencing in communities and the lack of accountability is that we just have this incumbent that is impervious to people's criticism. So let's see what happens when we change and whether our democracy is able to respond. And that'll send in a message to incumbents that you're not going to be in power forever.
Things can change.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, a lot of people are saying, coalitions are terrible. How do we function in coalitions? And I want to bring in some of your experience in the US as you did an internship there in Congress. But, I've often said to people that you can't have one person deciding on everybody else's fate. And I said this to say, if you look at the ANC in the last 5-10 years, every vote that we've ever had in Parliament, it is just one or two individuals in the ANC that disobeyed this party line. And you even had the speaker coming out and saying, you will toe the party line, and her tone was to say, if you don't toe the party line, we'll deal with you.
Yeah.
And you find that a lot of our politicians, that a lot of people get into government, when they get there, they're told, oh, welcome, you're going to vote this, that, and that, and that's it, And we sort of have this constitutional system where the people that go to Parliament are just there to fill that seat, get paid, and that's it. And where I want to take this question is to say, how would you see the best possible coalition working? Can you maybe share some of your percentages as to what, in your world, what you think the coalition percentages should be? And how do you think would best move or transition, as many people are saying we are going to go into coalition government?
Well, it's a great question, and it's like the question of our time right now, I guess. I think that we are entering a really fundamental moment in the life of our democracy. If you look at other democracies like India, for example, the Indian National Congress, which was their African National Congress, was in power for ages and ages, and everyone thought they would never lose power. And when they lost power, it was so swift that people couldn't believe, how fast it happened. And at some point, I think in South African life, I don't know exactly when, it's going to happen so fast that we are just shocked, because there's still people now who are like, I don't care how bad things are, the ANC can't lose. They just will never lose. The fact of the matter is they can. But and when you reach that tipping point, things change forever. In terms of just one of the running themes of our conversation that I wanted to pick up on as well, the closed party list is very much linked to what you're saying about people going to Parliament. And they're not there because people know who they are. They're there because they're part of the party. So perhaps one reform that we should be considering, is let's just open the party lists at least, right? So that people, okay, sure, they're voting for the ANC, but they also know the candidate of the ANC. They're not just voting for a black box of a party. They're voting for a party, but the party's telling you who the person is that they're voting for. So that's one potential opportunity. As far as coalitions go, I think we must separate noise from governance on that. And I don't think coalitions have been the disaster that people say they have. They've been very noisy. And yes, in Joburg, we've had about 300 mayors in the last 300 days, right? But has governance got really much worse since the coalitions got more noisy? I don't think so.
I agree with you.
Yeah, I think, yes, the news cycle has been very busy, and yes, there are different mayors, but I don't think things have got a lot worse. And so I think we have to approach this new period with a bit of maturity and appreciate that things are going to be quite a roller coaster. But we either go through that roller coaster and then find a new, different form of politics after that, or we stay in our comfort zone and we say, coalitions are messy, so I'm just going to go with the devil I know. And it's a difficult message to sell because nobody wants more uncertainty. But I think we have to get through that period of pain and uncertainty in coalitions so that we can get to a new place after that, which I think will be superior to where we are. Look, what I'm working with is that the ANC is somewhere between 43 and 47. I have a very simple method that I use. I look at all the polls that come out and I average those polls together, and that gives me a ballpark. So obviously the closer we get, the more likely the polls will be closer to the final result, but I do think that the ANC is somewhere below 50% right now. Now, I think the DA is stagnant at around late teens to early 20s. I think the EFF is on a growth path, but it is probably not going to get more than around 15, like early to high teens max from 10. So somewhere between 13 and there. And then, we'll see after that. That's where I'd put the big three. But obviously the rise of new entrants will mean that new entrants group will grow and it will be bigger. And I think that will throw up some interesting questions in the future. However, the new MK party, I think we actually have to take them very seriously in this election. If they, tick all the boxes and are able to go on the ballot and they survive their court challenges and internal disputes, I think they're really going to set the cat among the pigeons in this election. And we haven't seen polling data yet because it's all before they came in, but I can already see them maybe shaving off 4% of ANC vote nationally, which would then take them further down. So if the MK party gets its house in order, we could have...
I think for me, and I shared this with somebody to say, when you look at the US and you look at what's currently going on right now, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, the race is so close that both sides need to make an effort. Yeah. And I've said the same thing to say, the ANC has stopped making an effort because they got so comfortable with the Nelson Mandela legacy and we've got our voters. And I've said to people that it's important that in this election, we make sure that they don't get a majority, so that they can begin to make an effort. And I think that's very important. Because you look in America and you look at somebody like Donald Trump, who is very much a billionaire, like the current president we've got in our country. But you look at his effort into the election, where he attends court cases, where he actually goes out and he attends these rallies and people ask him important questions, where he's going and he's lobbying. I even attended a event where his team was going around other countries to lobby for him. And I said, this is very important because he's aware that he might lose. Yeah. He's aware that if I slip up, if my policies are not in place, if I don't do the right thing, I might just lose this. And in South Africa, we've had this political system where people sort of feel, I'm comfortable, I'm okay, I don't care. And when people tell them, fix this and that, they'll say, okay, we can fix it, but we know that it's not going to affect anything. We've got the majority.
Yeah.
And it brings me to what I'm saying to say, it's important that the coalition happens. Now, one point that we've done as a Rise South Africa, and I think that's important, is that we've realized that in many of these political parties, youth representation is not there. And my argument is always to say, in South Africa, we've got a majority youth population. Literally, our median age is very young. Secondly, we've got a system that must address youth challenges because that's the future. We're not saying that in a few years' time the youth would have no. We're saying right now the youth are the majority, and that's what we need to capitalize on. And I find that in many of these political parties, and I think I've said to a lot of people to say it's so unfortunate that we seem to be struggling with getting the youth to get involved in politics. But we need to make sure that when we get to Parliament, it is a young group of people that are there. And my argument has always stood to say that if we don't actually do that, we risk the big risk of losing out on all the gains of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, your AI, your blockchains, and the Fifth Industrial Revolution, and falling behind even further than the rest of the world. I want to talk a bit about your other book, Democracy Delusion. And I want to sort of bring in this concept of how do you think we should be fixing our democracy? I mean, we've got a lot of young people that are not voting or registered to vote. I, for one, was very disappointed by the numbers of young people that came in to say, we still have this big issue of young people not registering to vote. And I mean, you go on Twitter and you see Bonanga saying, let's vote. You see celebrities are saying, let's vote. You see everybody sort of pushing it. But the numbers are not where we would expect them to be. In your view, how do you think we should be fixing our democracy as we move forward as a country?
On your point about the comforts of incumbency, I fully agree. I mean, again, much as I think the ANC has failed dramatically over the last, certainly 15 years, this is what happens to incumbents. Like 30 years of incumbency in a democracy is unheard of in many places. And so I think part of what's happening is just the effects of being in power for so long and not being able to see outside that bubble. Like I said earlier, I know many people in the ANC. I grew up inside the ANC bubble. I have pictures of myself at 2 years old wearing an ANC t-shirt, because both of my parents were active in the ANC at that time. There is so much denial in ANC circles. you wouldn't believe it. Like, there's always an excuse, there's always some external force, there's always some conspiracy that has led us to the point where we are now, and it's never we have failed to govern. And it's really hard to pierce through that. And also just to say, like, the ANC is a family. Like, it's a very tight-knit family. So when you break from the ANC, you're not just saying, I've changed my political choice. It means now you're not going to Bry's. Some people might not come to your funeral who are good. Like, that's how deep it is, you know? And that's what people need to understand about how deep the ANC goes in so many people's lives. And how hard it is to break from the ANC. As far as fixing our democracy, you know, I think we just need to start from scratch with this thing, honestly. Like, it's everything from, let's start, like, okay, we have a republic. I think that's fair enough. We keep the fact that we're a republic. And then the age-old question of political philosophy is, if you have a republic, what is the optimal way to constitute that republic? What's the best way to divide power and to divide wealth such that that republic thrives? I literally think we have to go back to that question and just think, like, the way we've constituted ourselves, which is what a constitution is. Some things are working, and some things have progressed, and other things aren't. And I feel like we almost need a constitutional review to go back to questions like you've raised about the electoral system, to go back to things like the 3 tiers of government, do they work? Why do we have these provinces? Why are there 9 and not 3 or 6 or 12?
Yes.
Or do we need them at all? Is the municipal system working? Is it not? What are the powers of national government? Because nobody seems to know who has power to do what, and I think this is part of the problem of a lack of service delivery beyond incompetence. Our constitution is so complex in terms of provincial, national, and local government that no one knows who's, like, you're like, why is there a pothole here? Well, because
this
the national
road belongs to.
Yeah, this is the national, so we can't touch the nationals, but the provincial can come in 2 weeks.
And the municipality will.
Then after that, the municipality has to get sign-off from national, and you're like, this doesn't work, people. So we need to think about how we constitute. We need to think about, are there new rights that 30 years has taught us that need to be introduced? And are the current system of rights in the Bill of Rights the optimal mix of rights, you know? Is there a right to money? Is there a right to income?
A right to land?
Is there a right to land that's explicit, you know? Which rights have worked? Which rights need to be rethought? Everything. Parliament. I'm just going through chapters of the Constitution. Is Parliament appropriately... why don't we have real debates in Parliament?
Yes.
How does the president come in? How does he get held accountable? What are the powers of the president? So I think we need to reconstitute South Africa. It's pie in the sky and it's idealistic, but at least when we start these conversations, people start thinking, okay, you know, maybe if we go back to the basics, there's something structurally in the way we've constituted that is holding us back, and I think that's true. And then all the way to, like, the election is happening in a very short period of time from now. There seems to be a mismatch between those who have the resources and those who have the ideas. And I think the donor class in South Africa needs to have a serious conversation with itself, because they keep funding people who don't have the right ideas, and then they have all the money, and then they flood the zone, and then those who have the ideas don't have the money. So, yeah, in some ways, I don't think that there's an offering that's exciting young people. Or if there is an offering, it's not readily available enough to crowd out the incumbents. And that is a problem, where people feel like there aren't options. And I'm like, well, there actually are a lot. We can't say we don't have a lot of options in South Africa, but we don't know about a lot of options. That's probably true.
I mean, that's what you've said about the donor class is so important, because I think in that donor class, the first thing we realize is that it's just a few people. And it's just a clique of people. And I think it's so dangerous, because what that means is that we're allowing these people to actually rule the country for a very long time. And I think that definitely needs to change in the way that South Africans understand how to actually go about influencing government. I think America's done very well with their lobbying, and having people in Congress or around Congress rather lobbying for certain policies and certain things, and ensuring that that process is a very open process. And I think in South Africa, we need to develop to that point. But to what you've said about restarting or pressing the reset button, I definitely agree on that, because I think that the system that many of the baby boomers, and I always say to people that since 1994 till date, the young people that have arisen through the times do not relate to what they see going on. They don't relate. None of them watch anything that happens in Parliament. They're not interested. They're not engaged. They don't want to do anything about it. Yeah. And I think it's important for us to reset it so that it speaks to them. And in that speaking to them, I definitely agree with the approaches that you're taking and the things that you're saying. The one thing that I also want to talk about is the educational system. I mean, you've studied and you're at Wits, and you left and you went to Oxford and you're back. The one thing I found in South Africa, and I'll be very honest about it, is that I went to UJ and I really found my education to be useless. I found that whatever I was learning from the lecturers, certain aspects I thought I knew more than them, and I think I've proven that I've known more than them. The second thing is I felt that what they were teaching was outdated. And I was the type of student that I'd sit in and listen to what the lecturer is saying, and I'd be referencing through the internet. And what they're teaching, I'd raise my hand and ask, hey, do you know about this? And they'll say, sorry, that's not in the textbook. And I'd immediately think, oh, okay, so we're here to please a textbook. And that sort of allowed me to understand that our education system didn't work. And I went to Stanford University and I studied entrepreneurship there. And when we got there, they were like, oh, sorry, we're not going to print out a textbook because they're outdated. Please look at your ebook. This is what we're learning. And after that learning, they're sort of, okay, your case studies are on Facebook, whereas in South Africa, the case studies were in a company that's 100 years old that's about to be liquidated. Yeah. And when I came back to South Africa, I sort of said to somebody and I said, look, I don't think there's any university in our country that's fit for purpose. And I took it further to say that I find that private institutions are doing a much better job than our universities. But I want to hear from you. I mean, you've been to Oxford and you've also studied here. What do you think is wrong with our educational system and what needs to be fixed?
It's an interesting point that you raise because it goes back to the heart of what do you think the purpose of an education system is. And I think there are at least two purposes. The first is, if you look at it like, and there's nothing wrong with this, like there are minds and they need to be given these skills that match the economy so that they can get jobs. And, they need to be on the cutting edge of that knowledge so that they can be on the cutting edge of the job market. And you need that in an education system. There's no doubt about that. And South Africa is very far behind. I share your concerns about the outdatedness of our education system. Universities are better. If we go to public schools, goodness knows, how outdated, even the culture of those schools is, for all the uncertainty that we're going into. But, the weird thing at Oxford is the most prized degree is ancient history, classics. Yeah. So you can have your medical doctors, you can have your astrophysicists, you can have your entrepreneurs, etc. But the height of learning in Oxford is ancient history and philosophy. And so I think the second part of an education system is beyond what you can get from an education system and its utility to the economy. How are you unlocking people's ability to actually think deeply and outthink problems that no education system has formulated in advance? And how are you giving them the intellectual confidence to trust their ideas? And that's what I found at Oxford. Ultimately, it's not arrogance, but I think we have the opposite problem in South Africa, that we're so timid and we so doubt our ideas that we don't think we could say anything of global importance. And when you get to Oxford, everyone's like, yeah, I'm going to be the next Isaac Newton. I'm going to be the next this. Why? Because that's where Isaac Newton literally studied. And it brings out a certain confidence in your own mind and a confidence in your own ideas that we have not found in our education system in South Africa. So if I really think what was the true lesson I learned, it was obviously study hard and think deeply, but then trust that you have something to say. You might be wrong many of the times, but you might be right some of the time. And that might be a fundamental contribution. And I feel like our education system, no matter how good you are and what marks you get, do you believe that you could be the best in the world? Even if you are the best in the world, do you believe you are? I don't think we have that confidence yet. And that's what institutions like Stanford and Oxford can give you, is like, there's no smarter person outside this institution. Like, you are the smart person. Now have the confidence to figure this out.
And I think, I mean, what you're saying is what I experienced when I went to Stanford. And everybody was sort of saying, okay, well, we're here, we want to see this. I said to the guy who was showing us around, I said, can I see where Mark Zuckerberg stayed, you know? And he was like, oh, that's an odd thing. And I'm like, that's it. And everybody was like, oh, I want to see this library. I want to see. I'm like, okay, I'll get there. I just want to see. Yeah. And when I got to the dormitory, I was like, oh, this was Mark Zuckerberg's dormitory. I went in, and it was just a small bed, prison bread, little bookshelf there, pillar, that's it. Yeah. And I stood there and I was like to the guy, I was like, are you lying? Are you? And he was like, no, this is where Mark Zuckerberg built Facebook. And I was like, no, man, surely there has to be. And he was like, this is it. And I think it's that, to say that the fact that the environment they're in, that's what they're taught and they understand that's important. But about the history point, I mean, I've never thought of that. I mean, ancient history, and because there's something in the Bible that says, in Ecclesiastes, says there's nothing new under the sun. And it alludes to the fact that whatever you're trying to do has been done before. And you just have to think in a certain way that's been thought before. And when you say this, to say the upper echelon of studying in Oxford is studying philosophy and history, I think that's interesting. Can you go deeper into that?
Absolutely. So there's this long-standing set of subjects called classics. And that's where all the best Oxonians go. And if you get a first in classics, then you are like the top of the academic piles, certainly for undergraduate life. And classics is ancient literature, it's ancient philosophy, and it's ancient history. So you'll go back to Greece, you'll go back to Rome. Unfortunately, there are many classical civilizations that are left out of that curriculum, which should be included. So in Africa, we should have classics. We should have what are the classics? What are the ancient forms of wisdom and philosophy and thinking that we as a civilization have developed? And we should be training our best minds to study that. In addition to like AI, imagine at the same time you're like studying classics, AI, now we're talking, right? But at Oxford, that is the preeminent degree. And then, of course, philosophy, which is a bit newer. Like when you talk new at Oxford, you're talking hundreds of years. But the fundamental ideas and the depth of thinking, how deep can you go? And ultimately, whatever problem you have, right, is ultimately a philosophical problem. How deep can you think through that problem? And how deep can you think through the solution? That's what philosophy ultimately is. It's asking fundamental questions about fundamental problems. And so if you can do those things, then you can do anything, right? You can learn economics, or you can learn rocket science, because they are applications of that deeper form of thinking.
Yeah. That's so profound. I mean, I'm sitting and I'm thinking what you're saying is so profound, because Africans don't have some form of history that they can hold on to. When the Netflix series came out about Shaka Zulu, I said to somebody that it's embarrassing that we're learning about Ushaka from an American company that decided to deploy capital. And you see our royal leaders, etc., sort of plugging in. And you sort of ask yourself to say, how much did Netflix spend? Could we not have enough as a government to do that? And even where we are today, the person who's watching SABC does not know that story because it's not there. It's on Showmax and trickles down to all these paid platforms. So I think what you're saying is very profound, to say that could be something that we could look into to begin to teach that. Absolutely. From school, to say, look, in Mapungubwe, they were mining gold before Europe started the first industrial revolution. And how do they do it? And these are the artifacts of it, and this is what happened. So I think that's really amazing. And in closing, I mean, you've had quite an interesting journey, and I think you've done a whole lot of different things that have really impacted the country. What's the legacy that you want to be remembered for? What is it that you're trying to aim to live for, achieve?
I don't know, but I think it comes back to what we were saying at the beginning. Like I have always aspired, or at least been really inspired by polymaths. Not to say that I believe I'm there yet, but by people who have developed multiple intelligences in different spheres, like the capacity to understand law, but then music, and then science, and that's what excites me. I don't know if I'll ever get there, but I'm really interested and fascinated in mastering multiple different domains. So if I had a perfect professional life at the end, people would be like, wow, how did you master all of those different seemingly disparate domains. But it makes you look pretty crazy at the beginning because people are like, why are you still trying to rap, bro? Like, but at the end of the day, it's like music is a domain, that you want to learn and master. And then, there's law and there's media. And so that's what excites me. That's what excites me. That's what I hope to achieve.
Wow, I love that. I think in a lot of what you're saying, I think that's the purpose of the human being. To explore all your gifts and talents to their maximum.
Absolutely.
Ensure that you live that. I love that. And in closing, do you have any message for anybody who's viewing? There's a lot of young people that are inspired by you, that look up to you. What message would you give them?
No, I think just I'd throw it back to you, and good to see that you're starting this podcast. I think digital media is like the new form of knowledge creation that people will take for granted in the future. But those of us who are at the forefront of it now have seen something that I think is in the future, and that's why I was excited to hear that you're doing this and coming on, because I think building this ecosystem of digital voices has its dangers, but the exciting thing about it is that we are possibly at a point where we can challenge mainstream narratives for the first time in a long time, and our audiences who watch this need to understand that they have power to shift and maybe break an old form of media and start a new one, and take it in a direction that's more productive.
Wow. No, thank you so much for having us, and continue doing the great stuff.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, subscribe to my podcast as well, by the way.
Oh, yes, definitely. Definitely do so. Thank you so much.
Cool, man. Thanks, Mpho. You can follow me at Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh on social media, and on YouTube, SMWX is the YouTube channel.